When it comes to President Trump's economic policies, and the main one being tariffs, there's kind of two sides to the story, right? There's the impact on prices and inflation, on the affordability debate, and then there's the benefit of tariffs that President Trump keeps talking about, and that is drawing investment into the U.S. economy, more domestic production in the U.S., less reliance on imports and so on. And as we've heard from him increasingly in recent months, there's been this number that keeps going up, and he's reached $21 trillion, he says, in pledges from companies and countries to invest in the United States. Now, the White House lists $9.6 trillion. I just checked it a few minutes ago. It's still there. And we dove into those numbers, and we found that actually really only about $7 trillion of that counts as investment. So the investment boom that President Trump is talking about at $21 trillion really looks more like $7 trillion. And we should say even that $7 trillion has a lot of questions hanging over it. It's not clear how much of that is real or is going to end up being real investment rather than kind of spending on salaries and supplier costs and so on.
Okay, that's detail and that's nuance for someone like President Trump, who focuses on the big numbers. And even at $7 trillion, that is pretty meaningful. According to our reporting, that is more than all the foreign direct investment accumulated since the U.S. began tracking that kind of data. So if $7 trillion ends up coming through, how significant is that to the U.S. economy?
Look, absolutely. $7 trillion would, over the next 4 years, would be a historic number. We think it works out to be closer to $6 trillion over the next 4 years if you track the actual timelines of these pledges that have been made. Some of these pledges are over 10 years and so on. That works out to be 1.5% of GDP. That works out to be $1.5 trillion a year, somewhere around 5% of GDP, and that is monumental. That's up there with some of the injections that we've seen, like the New Deal, the fiscal rescue plans around the Great Recession. It gets up there with the railway investment boom of the 1880s. This is big stuff in the economy. That's one of the reasons economists have some questions over whether it will actually happen. The key question being whether this is part of the kind of normal investment, and a lot of that is reflected in the $5 or so trillion that you get invested in the U.S. economy as part of, that's in the GDP figures that we see every year, or whether it ends up being on top of that. So again, when I say there's big questions about it, yes, this is a potentially historic number, but it's a historic number with lots and lots of questions.
So I guess one of the questions that I think a lot of folks have is, who's going to make sure these commitments, these pledge commitments, are actually collected? I kind of feel like governments, companies, they figured out how to work with President Trump and this administration. Talk nicely, flatter him, pledge some big investments, and then you generally get better treatment. Is there someone who's tasked with really seeing that this money is actually invested?
Follow through?
Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, we will see, right? The big stick that President Trump has here in most cases is tariffs, and we've seen him threaten that. We've also seen in the case of the United Arab Emirates, for example, the Commerce Department say, okay, listen, we're going to give you export licenses to buy AI chips, as we've agreed, but for every $1 billion of chips that you buy, you have to come up with $1 billion in investment. So that's kind of an enforcement mechanism that's popped up. But, again, we're going to have to wait and see how hard it is to enforce these things. We should say in the first Trump administration, and we talked about this in the story briefly, President Trump got a $350 billion commitment from the Saudis. And we looked into the numbers in terms of foreign direct investment, and we found in the 4 years after that, actually, the foreign direct investment by Saudi Arabia in the United States only grew by about $5 billion. So there's some big gaps between these promises and what is often the reality, and we're going to have to wait and see if that actually what turns out this time.